The young woman walked out of her small apartment, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and doubt. She glanced down at her worn-out shoes, feeling an odd sense of self-consciousness creeping in. It was hard to believe she was about to go on a blind date at a fancy restaurant, one that seemed completely out of her league. But then again, what did she have to lose? Her friend had practically begged her to go, insisting that it would be a fun distraction, even though she wasn't sure how much fun it would really be. "It'll be an adventure," her friend had said, "and besides, you deserve something nice for once." The invitation had come out of the blue, and though she was hesitant, the thought of a night away from her daily routine was enough to convince her to say yes. She didn't know much about her date, just that he was someone important, someone who worked in business. The details were fuzzy, and the lack of information made her nervous. She was used to casual dates, coffee shops, quiet parks, or the occasional bar where she could blend into the crowd. But this was a whole different world. The restaurant was located in the heart of the city, surrounded by towering buildings and bustling crowds, a place she'd only ever seen in movies or read about in magazines. As she took the bus to the venue, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her modest upbringing. The people around her wore expensive clothes, and she felt out of place in her secondhand dress. She ran her fingers through her hair nervously, hoping she looked presentable enough. What was she even doing here? She didn't belong in a place like this, surrounded by wealth and elegance. When she arrived at the restaurant, she almost turned back. The valet opened the door to the grand building, and she stood frozen, staring up at the glass doors as they slid open. Inside, chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm golden light over the immaculate tables. Waiters in black suits moved gracefully between the diners, serving delicate plates of food. The entire place smelled of luxury, and she felt like she was intruding. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, trying her best to appear confident despite the pit forming in her stomach. The host at the front desk greeted her with a smile that seemed a little too perfect. "Your party is waiting," he said, leading her to a table tucked in a quiet corner of the restaurant. The table was set for two, and she recognized him immediately. He was tall, his back straight, dressed in a well-tailored suit that made him stand out even more in this elegant setting. He had the kind of presence that demanded attention, and as she walked toward him, she couldn't help but feel small in comparison. His dark eyes met hers with a hint of amusement, though she couldn't tell whether it was a welcoming look or something else entirely. "Hello," he said smoothly, standing up to greet her. "I'm glad you could make it." His voice was deep, almost soothing, and she found herself momentarily lost in the way he spoke. His handshake was firm, yet there was a casual ease about him. He wasn't nervous at all, unlike her. There was something undeniably confident about him, a quality that made her second-guess everything she had ever known about her place in the world. She slid into the chair across from him, trying her best to hide her discomfort. "Thanks for inviting me," she said, her voice a little shakier than she intended. She could feel her hands sweating, and she quickly folded them in her lap. The CEO smiled again, his gaze flicking over her as if he were assessing her. She shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny, but then he looked away, glancing at the menu. "I hope you don't mind the setting. It's a bit more upscale than a typical dinner," he said, "but I think it's a good place to talk." She nodded, unsure how to respond. Her mind was racing. What was she supposed to say? What did people talk about in places like this? All she could think about were the small things that felt so out of place. Her chipped nails, the way her dress didn't quite fit right, the fact that she hadn't been able to afford a proper meal in days. She was so far out of her element that it almost seemed laughable. But then he looked at her again, this time with something more genuine in his eyes. "You seem nervous," he said. "Don't worry. I'm not here to make you uncomfortable." Her cheeks flushed at the comment. It was strange. How could he be so calm when she felt like everything was wrong? But somehow his words made her feel a little less self-conscious. The conversation started slowly. He asked about her work, about her life, and she tried to keep things light. She told him about the small apartment she rented, about the small victories and struggles that filled her everyday life. And as she spoke, she realized that she wasn't just talking to him out of obligation. There was something in his demeanor that made her feel like he was actually listening. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. Instead, he simply nodded, offering a few words of encouragement here and there. For a moment, she forgot that she was at a fancy restaurant with someone who could probably buy anything he wanted. She forgot about the grand surroundings and focused on the conversation. It wasn't easy, but she allowed herself to relax just a little. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be as bad as she had imagined. Meanwhile, the CEO found himself surprised by her openness. He had assumed that the woman sitting across from him would be like all the others, polished, perfect, with a smile that hid any trace of vulnerability. But she wasn't like that. She was real. She didn't put on airs, didn't pretend to be something she wasn't. And there was something incredibly refreshing about that. As they talked, he couldn't help but notice how different she was from anyone else he'd ever met. Her honesty was disarming, and he found himself drawn to her in a way he hadn't expected. He had come to this dinner with one intention: to satisfy the dare from his friends, to prove that he could entertain himself with someone who wasn't part of his usual world. But as the evening wore on, he realized that he wasn't playing the game anymore. He was genuinely interested in her. The waiter arrived, breaking the silence between them, and they ordered their meals. The food arrived soon after, but it was almost secondary to the conversation they were having. He noticed the way she ate with such care, savoring each bite as though it was a rare treat. To him, it was a reminder of the simple joys in life, the things he had forgotten to appreciate in the whirlwind of his career. As the evening went on, they continued to talk. The girl laughed at his jokes, and he found himself smiling more than he had in months. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about work, about the pressure to maintain his image, about the expectations that came with being at the top. Instead, he was simply enjoying her company, something he hadn't realized he missed. And so the night passed. By the time the check arrived, neither of them was ready to leave. They exchanged a few more words, and the CEO offered to walk her home. She hesitated, unsure whether she should accept. After all, wasn't this just another game for him? A way to get a laugh from his colleagues? But there was something in the way he looked at her now, a sincerity that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. She agreed to let him walk her out, and as they left the restaurant, the night air felt cooler than it had when she first arrived. She glanced at him, unsure of what to think. Was this really just a joke to him? Or was he genuinely interested? As they parted ways, he asked if he could see her again. She was caught off guard. She'd assumed that he'd had his fun for the evening and would move on to the next thing, but he didn't seem to be in any rush to leave. Maybe, she replied, her voice a little softer now, but we'll see. He smiled and nodded, then disappeared into the night. She stood there for a moment, staring after him. Had she just spent the evening with someone who wasn't who she thought he was? Or was this just the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand? The following weeks felt strange for the young woman. After that dinner, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She told herself it was just a one-time thing, an awkward evening with a man who probably didn't even remember her name. But deep down, something had shifted. She couldn't deny that she'd enjoyed their conversation, that there was something about him that was different from anyone she'd ever met. The CEO, who she still didn't know much about, had been so kind, so easy to talk to, and even more surprisingly, he had asked if he could see her again. At first, she had brushed it off. She figured it was just another rich guy looking for a bit of fun, someone who'd gotten bored with his usual crowd and wanted to see if he could charm someone with a real life. It was the kind of thing people like him did, right? They played games, and when they got bored, they moved on. She had convinced herself that was the end of it, but the calls kept coming. Not every day, but enough to make her second-guess her assumptions. At first, he'd called to check in, asking how her week had been, and she'd felt awkward talking to him. She wasn't used to having conversations like this, casual, genuine. It was easier for her to talk to her friends, to the people she knew, but him, he was different. He had an air of mystery about him, and that was what kept her on edge. She didn't want to get attached to someone who could be playing with her emotions. One day, after a particularly long workday, her phone buzzed with another message from him. "Hey, how's your day going? Want to grab coffee sometime this week?" The message was simple, nothing extravagant, but it was enough to make her pause. He didn't seem to be making any grand gestures, and for some reason that made her more curious. She stared at the phone for a moment. The idea of meeting him again made her nervous, but the thought of it also stirred something inside her, an excitement that she couldn't ignore. After a long moment, she replied, Sure, I'd like that. How about Thursday? The response was instant. Perfect. I'll pick you up at 5. It felt surreal. Here she was, agreeing to meet with a man she barely knew, someone who seemed to be from an entirely different world. But as the days passed, her nerves started to settle. She remembered how easy it had been to talk to him, how he had listened with real interest. Maybe this wasn't some elaborate joke after all. Thursday came quicker than she expected. She spent the afternoon preparing, trying on different outfits, but nothing felt quite right. She didn't have anything fancy, no expensive dresses or designer clothes. She was just herself, and it felt like the best she could offer. She settled on a simple blouse and jeans, something she felt comfortable in, though she was still unsure if it would be enough. When he arrived to pick her up, he was already standing outside her apartment building, looking as polished as he had the last time. He smiled when he saw her and opened the car door for her, a gesture that made her heart skip a beat. She got in, buckling her seatbelt, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He glanced over at her as they drove. "You look nice," he said, his tone casual but warm. She smiled, a little embarrassed. "Thanks. I didn't know what to wear." "You look just fine," he reassured her, his eyes briefly meeting hers before focusing back on the road. "I'm glad you agreed to meet again." "Yeah," she said, feeling a little unsure. "I wasn't sure if I should, but I don't know. I thought maybe we could give it another try." He nodded, his lips curving into a small smile. "I'm glad you did. I've enjoyed our conversations." She appreciated his honesty, though it made her nervous. It was all moving so fast. They arrived at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place far more laid back than the posh restaurant they'd met at before. It was small, cozy, and had a charm that made her feel a little more at ease. As they entered, the soft hum of conversation and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, making everything feel a little more normal. They ordered their drinks and sat down at a table by the window. The conversation started off slow, but soon enough, the chatter flowed easily between them. She found herself laughing at his jokes, surprised by how much she enjoyed his company. He was charming, but in a way that didn't feel forced. He wasn't trying to impress her, not in the way she had expected. It was just two people talking, no pretensions, no games. As they talked about everything from their favorite books to the music they liked, she couldn't help but notice how different this felt from other dates she had been on. With other men, there was always an underlying pressure to be someone they expected her to be, to fit into a mold. But with him, she didn't feel that way. She could just be herself, and he seemed to appreciate that. He asked her about her work, and she told him about her job at a small office, handling paperwork and doing menial tasks for low pay. It wasn't glamorous, but it was what she had. She felt a little embarrassed as she spoke, but he didn't judge her. In fact, he seemed interested in her story, genuinely curious about her life. It was refreshing. "Sounds like you're doing the best you can," he said with a nod. "I admire that." She blinked, surprised. "You do?" "Of course," he replied with a smile. "Not everyone has the same opportunities, but that doesn't mean they can't make the most of what they've got. You seem like you're doing just that." Her heart warmed at his words. It wasn't something people often told her. In fact, most of the time, people looked down on her for not having the same things they did. But here was a man who seemed to see her for who she was, not what she had or didn't have. As the conversation continued, she started to realize something she hadn't expected. She was starting to like him, really like him. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic moment. It was the way he made her feel comfortable, the way he listened without trying to impress her. She found herself opening up more than she had ever intended to, telling him about her hopes, her fears, and her dreams for the future. And then, as the afternoon wore on, she noticed something else. He wasn't talking about his own life the way she had expected. She had assumed he would boast about his career, his accomplishments, his wealth. But he didn't. He talked about his work, sure, but in a way that didn't make it sound like the most important thing in his life. He shared little anecdotes about his family, about how he had grown up, and how it had shaped the person he was today. It was in that moment that she realized just how different he was. He wasn't like the other men she had met. He didn't see her as someone to impress or win over. He saw her as a person, someone with thoughts, feelings, and experiences worth sharing. When the date ended, she felt a sense of sadness she hadn't expected. She had enjoyed herself more than she thought possible. and for the first time in a long time she felt like she could really trust someone. As they said their goodbyes, he smiled at her. "I had a great time. Maybe we can do this again sometime?" She hesitated but then nodded, feeling a flutter in her chest. "I'd like that." And with that, he left, walking to his car with a confident stride, leaving her standing there, feeling both confused and hopeful at the same time. Was this really happening? Had she just gone on a second date with a man she barely knew? A man who seemed to understand her more than anyone else? She couldn't be sure yet, but for the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something real. The days after their second meeting felt like a blur. The young woman had never imagined that someone like him, someone so seemingly out of her reach, would want to spend more time with her. At first she told herself that it was probably just a passing interest for him. After all, how could a successful, powerful man like him genuinely be interested in someone like her? She was just an ordinary woman, struggling to make ends meet, while he had everything: money, status, and influence. But despite the doubt swirling in her mind, she couldn't deny that each time he called or sent a message, she felt a flutter of excitement. They continued to meet for coffee, lunch, and sometimes just a quick walk around the park. They talked about everything, from books and movies to life's bigger questions. She found herself opening up more with each passing day, sharing things she had never shared with anyone before. At first it was just small talk, the usual things you would expect on a date, but gradually their conversations grew deeper, more meaningful. She found herself confiding in him about the struggles she faced, how she sometimes felt invisible in the world, how her dreams seemed so far out of reach. He listened without judgment, offering gentle words of encouragement. "I think you're selling yourself short," he told her one afternoon as they sat at a small cafe by the river. "You have so much more to offer than you realize." Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, but it was the first time she allowed herself to believe it. For so long she had convinced herself that her dreams were too big for someone like her, that she was destined for a life of struggle and mediocrity. But when he looked at her with those kind, thoughtful eyes, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe she was wrong. He asked her about her passions, things she hadn't thought about in years. She told him how she used to love painting, how it used to be her escape from the world, but life had gotten in the way and she had put it aside. He encouraged her to pick it up again, to do what made her happy. "You deserve to follow your passion," he said. "Don't let anything stop you." His words stayed with her long after they parted ways. She wasn't used to hearing that kind of encouragement, especially from someone like him. It was easy for people to tell her to follow her dreams when they had the resources to make it happen. But he wasn't like that. He wasn't just offering advice from a place of privilege. He genuinely seemed to care about her well-being. And yet, despite the growing connection between them, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time they met, she found herself more and more drawn to him. But the question that haunted her was simple. Why? Why would a man like him be interested in someone like her? One evening, after they had spent the afternoon walking through the park, they stopped by a bench to sit and talk. The air was cool and the leaves crunched underfoot as they sat in comfortable silence. She looked at him, feeling a wave of vulnerability wash over her. It was strange how easy it had become to talk to him, how natural it felt to share her thoughts with him. But still, there was a barrier between them, a space she couldn't quite cross. He was always so composed, so confident. She, on the other hand, was still trying to figure out who she was, and that uncertainty made her doubt herself more than she cared to admit. "Do you ever feel like you're not where you're supposed to be?" she asked him, her voice quiet. "Like you're just floating through life, trying to figure things out, but not really knowing how to get where you want to go?" He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "All the time," he admitted. "Even when it seems like I have everything figured out. There are still days when I don't know what the next step should be. But I think that's part of life, isn't it? We're all just trying to find our place, to make sense of it all." His honesty surprised her. For a moment, she saw a glimpse of the person beneath the polished exterior. It was easy to assume that someone like him had everything under control, that he never doubted himself or felt lost. But hearing him speak so openly made her realize that even the most successful people had their own struggles. It made her feel less alone. They spent the rest of the evening talking about their hopes and fears, their dreams and disappointments. It was one of the most real conversations she had ever had, and as they parted ways that night, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in a long time. Maybe it wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about finding someone who understood that uncertainty and was willing to walk through it with you. Over the next few weeks, they continued to meet regularly. It became a routine, something she looked forward to. They would grab coffee or lunch, take walks, and talk about everything under the sun. He was always kind, attentive, and present in a way that made her feel seen. And though she still had moments of doubt, when she questioned why he was interested in someone like her, she couldn't deny the connection that was growing between them. But one evening, as they sat together in a small cafe, something shifted. He was more quiet than usual, his eyes distant as he sipped his drink. She watched him for a moment, feeling a pang of concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers. For a brief moment, she saw something in his eyes, something guarded, something he wasn't sharing. But then it was gone, replaced by the usual calm demeanor he carried. He nodded, offering her a faint smile. "Yeah, everything's fine, just work stuff." She wasn't convinced, but she didn't press. They continued their conversation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had learned over the past few weeks that there was more to him than he let on. He was always so composed, so in control, but she had begun to sense a vulnerability beneath the surface. The next few days were a blur. They didn't meet as often as they had before, and when they did, their conversations felt more strained, as if there was something unsaid between them. The young woman found herself wondering what had happened, why he had become so distant. She had been so sure that they were building something real, something meaningful, but now she wasn't so sure. It was on a rainy afternoon as she was walking home from work that she received a text from him. It was short, simple, and to the point. "I need to talk to you. Can we meet tomorrow?" Her heart skipped a beat. What was this about? She had a sinking feeling in her stomach, the kind you get when you know something is about to change, but you don't know how or why. The next day, they met at the same cafe where they had shared so many quiet moments. He was already sitting at their usual table when she arrived, his posture tense, his hands folded in front of him. She took a seat across from him, feeling the weight of the silence hanging between them. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her for a moment, then let out a sigh. "I don't know how to say this, but I think we need to slow things down," he said, his voice filled with uncertainty. Her heart sank. "Slow things down?" she repeated, barely able to believe what she was hearing. "Yeah," he said, looking away. I've been thinking a lot, and I don't want to hurt you, but I think I need to take a step back." The words hit her like a wave. She wasn't sure what to say, what to feel. Part of her wanted to argue, to tell him that she didn't want to slow down, that she wanted to keep going to see where this could lead. But another part of her understood. She had felt the shift too, the distance, the change in his demeanor. Maybe it was inevitable. Maybe they were moving too fast. "I understand," she said quietly, though it felt like her world was crashing down around her. I don't want to lose what we have." He met her gaze, his eyes soft but filled with regret. "I don't want to lose it either. But sometimes I think it's better to take a step back before things go too far." They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the cafe fading into the background. The young woman wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. This moment, this conversation, would change everything. The weeks that followed that conversation were nothing like she had expected. After he had said they needed to slow things down, a strange silence hung between them. They barely spoke for a few days, the distance between them growing each time. The young woman found herself replaying that conversation over and over, trying to make sense of it. What had happened? Why had things changed so suddenly? She had felt like they were building something real, something genuine, but now it seemed like it was all falling apart. She tried not to overthink it, but every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat, hoping it was a message from him. But more often than not, it wasn't. She spent her days at work, her mind drifting as she tried to focus on her tasks. Her colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor. She wasn't the same. She had always been quiet, but now she was distant, lost in her thoughts. Her friend, who had initially encouraged her to go on that first blind date, could see it too. "You've been off lately," her friend said one afternoon as they sat together during lunch. "What's going on?" The young woman sighed and ran her fingers through her hair. I don't know. I think things with him are complicated. Her friend raised an eyebrow. You mean the CEO? Yeah, she said softly. He said he needed to slow things down. I don't really know what that means. Her friend looked at her thoughtfully as if weighing her words. You're not the kind of person who plays games. Neither is he from what you've told me. Maybe he's just figuring things out. You should talk to him. But talking to him seemed impossible. She didn't want to be pushy, didn't want to seem like she was desperate for answers, and yet every part of her yearned to understand. Why had he pulled away? Was it something she had done? She couldn't help but feel like she had somehow failed him, that she wasn't enough. One evening after another quiet day, she found herself sitting by the window, staring out at the city. The sky had turned a soft pink, the streets below bustling with people, but she felt as if she were the only one left in the world. She missed him, more than she cared to admit, and she hated how much she missed him. As she sat there, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from him. I've been thinking about us a lot, it read. Can we talk? Her heart raced and a mixture of relief and nervousness flooded her chest. He had finally reached out. She quickly typed a response. Of course. When? I'll be there in 30 minutes, he replied. The young woman's hands trembled as she put her phone down. She couldn't explain why she felt so anxious. Maybe it was because she had no idea what to expect, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation would be different. Maybe it would be the end, or maybe, just maybe, it would be the beginning of something new. Half an hour later, the doorbell rang and she jumped, her heart beating faster. She opened the door to find him standing there, looking just as composed as always. But there was something different about him. His eyes were tired, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of something heavy had settled on him. Hey, he said quietly, offering her a small smile. Hey, she replied, stepping aside to let him in. I'm glad you texted. He nodded and walked in, his gaze scanning the room. She could tell he was nervous, just like she was. Neither of them spoke for a moment as he sat down on the couch, and she followed, sitting across from him. So, she said softly, breaking the silence. What's going on? He exhaled slowly, his hands clasped together in his lap. I've been thinking about this for a while, he began, and I think I owe you an explanation. I've been distant, and I know that's hurtful, but it wasn't because I don't care about you. It's just... He trailed off, his gaze drifting to the window as if the answer was out there somewhere. She waited patiently, her heart in her throat. She wanted to hear what he had to say, needed to understand why he had pulled away. I've been so caught up in my life, he continued, his voice almost a whisper, in my work, in all the things I thought mattered. But the truth is, I've been avoiding what's right in front of me. You. And I'm sorry. She blinked, taken aback by his words. Avoiding me, she repeated, trying to make sense of what he was saying. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I didn't want to get too close to you because I didn't want to mess things up. I've always been in control of everything, but when it comes to you, I don't know how to do that. I don't want to hurt you, and I don't want to bring all my baggage into this, but I can't pretend anymore. I care about you more than I thought possible. The words hung in the air between them, and she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. She had been so afraid that he didn't care, that he had changed his mind about her. But hearing him say this, hearing him admit his own fears and doubts, made her realize that maybe they weren't so different after all. I'm sorry too, she said quietly. I didn't understand why you pulled away. I thought it was because of something I did, but I think I've been afraid too. He looked at her, his eyes filled with sincerity. Afraid of what? Afraid of opening up, of getting hurt, she admitted, her voice soft. I've never been in something like this before. And I didn't know if you were really serious about me or if I was just some distraction. He shook his head quickly. No, you're not a distraction. I'm serious about you. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of calm. They were both afraid, both uncertain, but they had something that was worth fighting for. She didn't need all the answers right now. She just needed to know that they were both willing to try. I don't want to rush things, he said softly, his voice gentle, but I don't want to lose you either. I think we can figure this out together. She smiled, a small but genuine smile, and nodded. I think so too. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air. but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was one of understanding, of mutual respect. They had come through the storm, and now, maybe, they were ready to see where this journey could take them. As the evening wore on, they talked about everything and nothing. They spoke about their fears, their hopes, and the future they both wanted to build, together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time, the young woman felt like she wasn't alone anymore. It had been a few weeks since the conversation that had changed everything. They both took things slow, carefully testing the waters of this new dynamic between them. There was no rush. They didn't have to have it all figured out. They were still getting to know each other in ways that felt deeper than before, as though their connection had been built on something real. They met regularly, sometimes for lunch or coffee, but there were also quiet evenings spent talking for hours, sitting on a bench in the park or walking down the quiet streets of the city. He no longer seemed distant, no longer trying to guard his emotions, and she felt lighter, as if a weight she hadn't realized was there had finally been lifted. One particular evening stood out. They had gone to dinner at a small, cozy restaurant. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet place where they could enjoy each other's company. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and they laughed over small jokes, sharing stories of their childhoods, of moments that had shaped them. Over dessert, he looked at her in a way that made her heart skip a beat. There was something about his gaze that felt different now, more intense, more sincere. She had grown used to his easy confidence, but in that moment he seemed almost vulnerable, as if there was something he was holding back. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of hesitation. She looked up from her dessert, her fork still in her hand. "Of course. What's on your mind?" He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking about the future," he began. "About us." Her heart skipped a beat. She had felt the shift in their relationship, the closeness, the trust, the way they no longer felt like strangers to each other. But to hear him speak about the future, to hear him acknowledge what they were building together, made everything feel more real than it ever had before. "I know we've both been through a lot," he continued, his voice low but steady. "And I don't want to rush anything, but I want to know if this is something you can see going somewhere." The question hung in the air, and for a moment she felt like time stood still. Her mind raced, her emotions swirling. She had never expected to be asked this, at least not so soon. They had started as two people just getting to know each other, both carrying their own doubts, their own fears. But now here he was, asking if they could make something more of it. Could she see this going somewhere? She thought about all the moments that had led to this point, the late-night talks, the shared laughs, the quiet understanding that had passed between them. She had never expected to feel so strongly for someone she had barely known just a few months ago, but somewhere along the way she had let her guard down, and in doing so she had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady but full of warmth. "I can see this going somewhere. I've never felt more sure of anything." His face lit up with a smile that made her heart flutter. "I'm glad you feel that way," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Because I'm not going anywhere." For the rest of the evening, they talked about everything, about their dreams, their goals, their plans for the future. The conversation wasn't rushed, wasn't forced. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, two people trying to build something together. After dinner, they took a walk under the soft glow of the streetlights. The city felt different that night, quieter somehow, as though the world around them had faded into the background. They walked side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, both lost in the moment. As they reached the park, he stopped and turned to her, his expression serious, yet gentle. "There's something else I've been meaning to tell you," he said, his voice a little shaky. She looked at him curiously, her heart racing with anticipation. What was it? What could he possibly want to tell her now? He took a deep breath, then spoke again, his words soft but filled with sincerity. "I know we've taken our time getting here, but I think I've fallen for you. I've fallen for who you are, for the way you make me feel when I'm with you." Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say those words, not yet at least. But there they were, hanging between them, making everything feel more real than it ever had before. She stared at him for a moment, trying to process what he had just said. And then, without thinking, she did the only thing that felt right. She stepped forward and kissed him. It wasn't a grand, passionate kiss, but it was everything they needed. It was the culmination of everything they had shared so far, the laughter, the doubts, the fears, and now the hope. It was a promise, unspoken but understood, that they were in this together. When they pulled apart, he smiled at her, his eyes full of warmth. "I've wanted to say that for a while," he admitted. "But I didn't want to rush things." She grinned, feeling her heart swell. "I'm glad you waited, because I feel the same way," and that was it. That was the moment that everything changed. The moment when they both realized that despite the fear, the uncertainty, the doubts that had once held them back, they were ready. Ready to take the next step together. From that night on, things between them were different. They didn't need to question where they stood or what they wanted. They both knew that they had found something rare, something worth holding on to. Over the next few months, their relationship grew even stronger. They learned more about each other, shared their deepest fears, their biggest hopes, and their quietest dreams. They traveled together, took weekend trips, and spent lazy afternoons at home, basking in the comfort of each other's presence. But it wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments where they had to confront the challenges of building a life together. There were moments when they disagreed, when their differences seemed too large to overcome. But through it all, they always came back to each other. And as time passed, they both realized that what they had was not just love, it was partnership. It was the kind of relationship where both people had room to grow, where they could be themselves without fear of judgment, and where they could support each other through the hard times. One afternoon, a few months after that first conversation about the future, they sat on the same park bench where they had shared so many quiet moments. The world around them was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He turned to her, his eyes full of meaning. "I know we've been through a lot, but I want you to know that I'm in this for the long haul. Whatever comes, I'll be here." She smiled at him, her heart full. "I know, and I'm here too, for as long as you'll have me." And that was the moment they both knew they had found something special, a love that wasn't just about the good times, but about supporting each other through everything life threw their way. The days after that moment in the park were filled with an undeniable sense of change. The young woman and the man had spent the months since their confession growing closer, their bond deepening with every shared laugh, every quiet evening spent together, and every challenge they faced. They had learned the rhythm of each other's lives, the small habits that made them unique and the quirks that made them who they were. In each other, they had found a companion, someone who didn't just accept them but truly understood them. As time passed, the young woman found herself settling into a routine that felt more like home than she had ever known. She had always been content with her quiet life, but now there was a sense of peace that came with having someone to share her days with. She no longer felt like she was navigating the world on her own. He was there for the good days and the bad ones, always offering a hand when she needed it, and a word of encouragement when things seemed too difficult. But it wasn't always perfect. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when she couldn't help but wonder if this relationship would be able to weather the storms that came their way. She had always been afraid of opening up completely, afraid of giving too much of herself and being let down. But with him, she had slowly learned to trust again. One evening as they sat together in their favorite cafe, she noticed something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. He was quiet, more so than usual, his gaze distant. She had learned to read him by now. He wasn't the type to hide his emotions easily, but when something was on his mind, he became withdrawn, lost in his thoughts. "Hey," she said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "What's going on? You've been quiet tonight." He looked up at her, his face softening when their eyes met. "It's nothing, just work stuff," he replied, but she could see the hesitation in his eyes. She knew him better than that. She could tell when something was bothering him. "You know you can talk to me, right?" she said, her voice full of reassurance. He hesitated for a moment, then let out a deep breath. "It's just, things have been a little overwhelming lately. There's a lot going on with the company, and I feel like I'm constantly trying to stay ahead of everything. I don't want to bring it home with me, but sometimes it's hard to shut it out." She listened, her heart heavy with understanding. She knew what it was like to feel weighed down by the pressures of life, to feel like there was always something more to be done. It was hard for her to see him struggle, especially when he always seemed so strong, so capable. But she knew that even the strongest people had their moments of doubt. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she said gently. "I'm here. You don't have to protect me from your stress. I want to be here for you just like you're here for me." His eyes softened and he reached across the table to take her hand. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he admitted quietly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm about to drown in all of this, and then I remember you and I remember what's really important." Her heart swelled at his words. It wasn't always easy, this relationship of theirs, but moments like these made it all worth it. The quiet understanding, the mutual support, the way they had learned to navigate the highs and lows together. "I'm glad I'm here," she said, squeezing his hand. "And I'm not going anywhere." He smiled, the weight lifting from his shoulders just a little. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice filled with sincerity. For the rest of the evening, the tension between them seemed to ease. They spent the time talking about lighter things, sharing stories, and laughing at old memories. The worries of the day had faded, replaced by the comfort of each other's presence. They both knew that life wasn't perfect, but they also knew that they could face whatever came their way, as long as they were together. But even in the midst of their growing closeness, there were still moments when the future seemed uncertain. The young woman had always been independent. She had built her life on her own terms, and the thought of fully relying on someone else was both comforting and terrifying. She had never imagined herself in a relationship where she depended on another person, but with him, she had found herself doing just that. It wasn't just the emotional dependency that was hard for her. There were practical matters too. Her life was simple, focused on her job and the small pleasures she had learned to enjoy. But his life, his world, was so much bigger. There were dinners with business partners, trips to far-off places, and events she didn't quite fit into. She had learned to adapt, to fit herself into his world, but there were still moments when she felt like an outsider. One weekend, they had gone on a trip to a luxury resort, a place he had been invited to for work. At first, she was excited to spend some time away from the routine, but once they arrived, she felt out of place. The guests were wealthy and polished, their lives so different from hers. She found herself shrinking into the background, unsure of how to interact with people who lived in a world that felt so foreign to her. It wasn't that anyone had treated her poorly. On the contrary, people were friendly enough. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. She felt like a fish out of water, lost in a world of suits and designer gowns, while she felt like she barely knew how to navigate the high-end etiquette. Later that evening, as they stood on the balcony of their room, looking out at the ocean, he could see the discomfort on her face. He stepped closer to her, his presence warm and reassuring. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't feel like I fit in here. Everything's so different." He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers in a reassuring gesture. "You don't have to fit in. You're perfect just the way you are," he said, his voice full of warmth. "I want you here because of who you are, not because of where you come from or what you wear." She looked up at him, her heart full of gratitude. "I'm just not used to all this," she admitted, feeling a little embarrassed. He smiled and cupped her cheek gently. "You don't need to be, and you don't have to pretend to be anyone else. I love you for exactly who you are." His words meant more than she could put into words. In that moment, she realized that it wasn't the world she didn't fit into. It was the expectations she had placed on herself. She had been so focused on fitting into his world that she had forgotten that the only thing that truly mattered was the connection they shared. The rest of the trip passed more smoothly. She let go of her insecurities, and she and he spent their time enjoying the peace and beauty of the resort. They didn't attend every event or mingle with every guest. Instead, they spent time together, just the two of them, and that was enough. When they returned home, things felt different. In a good way. She no longer worried about fitting in or measuring up. She had learned that in their relationship, they both brought something unique to the table, and that was enough. He didn't need her to be someone else, and she didn't need him to be perfect. They both just needed to be present, to show up for each other and to love each other as they were. With every passing day, she realized that their love wasn't about fitting into a mold or meeting expectations. It was about accepting each other, flaws and all, and that was the most beautiful thing of all.